So our first presenters will be Barry Austin. Right. Barry Austin, art handler installation specialist. Arthur Beukemann, art handler installation specialist. Philip Brutz, Mountmaker. Beth Edelstein, head of objects conservation. Carlo Maggiora, Mountmaker for the Cleveland Museum of Art. And the title of this presentation is Reuniting Krishna and his mountain at the Cleveland Art Museum. So, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be speaking about a 4-year conservation and remounting project of this sculpture of Krishna lifting Mount Govardhan at the Cleveland Museum of Art. The success of this project depended on many different colleagues and teams within the museum, partners in Cleveland and around the U.S., and international collaborations with colleagues in Cambodia and France. We're especially happy to have a chance to focus on the mount-making aspects of this project. I'll start with a quick background about the sculpture and its history, and how it came to present such a mount-making and installation challenge. The sculpture hails from the temple site of Phnom Da in southern Cambodia. There were 8 larger-than-life-size stone sculptures at Phnom Da, depicting Vishnu and his avatars and relatives. 2 of the 8 sculptures depicting Krishna lifting Mount Govardhan, showing the 8-year-old boy god with his left arm raised. These sculptures show Krishna in the act of lifting a mountain overhead to shelter his village from a storm, a miraculous feat that revealed his divinity. One of these is currently in the collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the other at the National Museum of Cambodia in Phnom Penh. The sculpture made its way to Cleveland in 2 parts. First was the torso, which had come into the collection of Adolphe Soclet, a wealthy collector in Brussels, and was sold to the museum in 1973 after Soclet's death. And second, the rest of the body parts. A large group of fragments had been found at the temple site in 1935 and shipped off to Soclet in Brussels. He attempted a reconstruction, but decided he preferred to leave the torso as a fragment. The rest of the pieces were buried in the neighbor's garden, where they stayed for 3 decades or so until the Cleveland Museum of Art excavated them in 1977 and brought them back to Cleveland. There were 17 pieces in all found in the garden, including more limbs that could fit on one figure, and 2 large pieces, one the lower part of a stela with feet, and upper section of the stela with a left hand. Conservators at the CMA in 1977 were thus presented with a puzzle, and it proved challenging to assemble a complete figure. The top section with the hands seemed to fit, but it was difficult to line it up with the base section with the feet. The CMA at the time chose to create a standing figure, and reassembled the torso with the legs and feet, leaving the top section, along with 8 other pieces, unused. The unused pieces were returned to Cambodia in 2006, and 6 were used to complete the other Krishna torso that had been found later at Phnom Da, though it was clear to the conservator there that the upper stela section did not fit with this torso. About a decade later, in 2014, the question of this fragment's proper attribution was reopened. Digital 3D models as well as full-scale prints were used to show that this section does in fact fit well on the back of the CMA torso, and it was returned to Cleveland in 2015 with the goal of creating a complete figure. 3D modeling was a huge component of this project, touching on many different aspects, including, of course, mount making, as we will see. The first overall scan was made in 2014 and was done at the suggestion of Philip Brutz, Mountmaker at the CMA and our co-author today, who had discovered that nearby Case Western Reserve University had a new laser scanner available for use at ThinkBox, their prototyping and maker space. The CMA worked with ThinkBox staff to scan the Cleveland Krishna and then to integrate this scan with one of the hand section, which had been scanned earlier that year while the Cambodian Krishna was on loan to the Met in New York. The resulting model is shown on the right and is the sculpture everyone expected to end up with at the end of this project. 3 printed models were made to help inform and facilitate the integration of the hand section into the figure, a full scale, a quarter scale, and even a pocket size. A number of digital models were also made and utilized along the way in addition to the initial laser scan, including various photogrammetry models done in-house and a full series of LiDAR scans and photogrammetry done by an outside team working on the exhibition content. This video shows the first photogrammetry model in which each of the blue squares represents a photo used to create the model. The conservation project to disassemble the entire sculpture and reintegrate the hand section began in early 2018. As the sculpture came apart over the following couple of years, we began to question the choices made in 1978 to unite the torso with the legs and feet. We continued to use 3D modeling and scanning to assess this, and traded 3D models and measurements back and forth with our colleagues in Cambodia to determine if the legs, feet, and base might in fact belong to the other Krishna in Phnom Penh. The 3D models, along with petrographic analysis and CT scanning of the stone, eventually gathered clear evidence that 3 sections of the legs, as well as the large base section with feet, should in fact be reunited with the Krishna sculpture in Cambodia. These sections were returned to Phnom Penh in late 2020. We also resolved that the right shin, sent back to Cambodia in 2006, belongs with the CMA figure, so this was brought to Cleveland as a long-term loan. The resulting sections now in Cleveland are highlighted here. The gray sections are now all in Cambodia. This meant that we now had about 900 pounds of stone that had to float in midair. The mount also had to accommodate the lower leg section and allow that to be placed in the correct position in space. I'm now going to turn it over to Carlo Maggiora, contract mount designer for the Krishna project.
The primary mounting support I had designed to incorporate the base section now had to be revised with this new information. The entire mounting system had been designed from the start to hold all the stone sections separate from each other while allowing them to be aligned properly. We wanted to keep the pieces separate in part because it had been so difficult to take them apart and because we wanted to allow for future changes to the assembly in case other fragments were identified in the future. Keeping them separate also allows for easier transport both within the museum and for external loans. The primary mounting frame consists of a column assembly with receivers to support the upper section and the torso, and a base assembly that supports and stabilizes the weight above. This base also takes the place of the sculpture's original plinth, which remains today in Phnom Da and Anurite. The column is separate from the base for transport. The base has wheels for moving it and adjustable leveling feet, as well as floor anchors for seismically active locations. Now, we will take you through the 4 parts of the mount from top to bottom. The upper section, with the figure's left hand, is in a fixed position with the sides perpendicular to the floor. Philip designed and fabricated a backplate with 2 clips at the sides and 2 shelves at the bottom with 2 pins that fit into pre-existing holes in the underside of the object. This mount incorporates a cleat that slides over a corresponding plate on the primary mount's column and is bolted in place at the back with 2 angle brackets. Philip also designed a lifting apparatus that bolts to the backplate and allows the hand to be easily moved and placed with a hoist. Finally, he made a floor stand that allows the section to remain upright at all times during moving, installation, and travel, reducing the need for handling. I designed and fabricated the torso mount, which consists of a solid steel T-shaped outrigger mirroring the original stone strut between torso and back stela. The bracket is secured to the torso with 2 5/8 11 cap screws inserted into anchors set into existing holes in the back. While we don't have room to discuss it here, we worked with engineering consultants in Case Western to assess the security of this cantilevered assembly. On the other end of the arm are two steel plates that are inserted into the receiver in the primary mounts column. Here, you can see the plates have slots to adjust position. On the right, you're looking at the back of the column with the torso mount in place and the receiver opening. Steel shim plates were fixed to the top and bottom of the receiver after the proper placement was determined. One of these plates on the top stays loose to allow for insertion and removal of the mount. Once in place, the mount is attached to the column with 8 bolts through the top and bottom plates. I'm going to pass the microphone now to Barry Austin, installation specialist, for the rest of this presentation.
Carlo designed the receiver slot plates, shim plates, and allowed for maximum adjustability while working toward the desired alignment between the torso and upper stela sections. This was one of the most challenging aspects of the mount design, as the two pieces needed to be precisely aligned to allow the figure's left arm to line up with his hand. Many months were spent on preliminary drawings, mock-ups, measurements from objects, and the 3D models. We then all gathered back at the museum right after the COVID shutdown and worked with both full-scale 3D printed model of the parts and the stone pieces themselves to further refine the alignment of the torso mount. We lost count of how many times we lifted and aligned the torso with the hand section, getting ever closer to the final result. This stage was greatly facilitated by a custom lifting mechanism that allowed the torso to be lifted from a prone position, rotated upright, and moved carefully into the primary mount, where it could be shifted in all directions in small increments. To make it more complicated, the stone pieces don't slide straight into place, but must be rotated slightly into each other to achieve the proper alignment. Along the way, we also had the opportunity to consult with a digital modeling expert who was creating content for the upcoming Krishna exhibition. Using Blender, he was able to provide critical angle measurements for each part of the torso mount relative to established vertical and horizontal planes. The left thigh has a sliding dovetail mount with 2 small set screws at the bottom. There was an existing gap between the thigh and the torso that allowed for these thin plates to be inserted. On the thigh section, the existing pins from the previous restoration were left in place as they were too close to the surface to remove. These were made into anchors for affixing the dovetail plate. On the torso side, new anchors were set with epoxy using a release agent on the threads so they can ideally be more easily removed in the future. Finally, the lower leg has a mount that had as much adjustability built in as possible, as the exact position of the leg was in the process of being finalized as we got to this point. The position was ultimately determined with reference to a conjectural 3D model of the Krishna as he would have looked completed, based largely on other sculptures from Phnom Da. For the exhibition, the Cambodian Krishna, now reunited with his legs and feet, traveled to Cleveland, and the two were displayed side by side. 2 other Phnom Da sculptures were also borrowed, along with other related stone artworks. This is the final installation in the Cleveland exhibition, showing fabricated cladding that hides the mount and recreates the form of the stone stela behind the figure as well as the plinth. Earlier this year, the exhibition traveled to Washington, D.C., where we successfully installed and deinstalled the Krishna at the National Museum of Asian Art. The sculpture is now back in Cleveland and awaiting installation on in our permanent galleries. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and we will go on to questions.
So now we'll open it up for questions for Arthur and the rest of the crew.
I'll start with the virtual question for all of you, and thank you for that talk. What adhesive was used for the receivers in the sculpture?
I'm going to let Beth take that one.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
So for the torso in the back, we used a Hilti epoxy RE500. And we did do some thorough testing of that with the engineering department at Case Western University. And then, show and tell. Here's a threaded anchor that you can see we modified an existing Hilti anchor and put that in with the RE500 epoxy. And then when we put anchors into the thigh, we used aerolite epoxy. Yeah, with a release agent. So when we were taking the sculpture apart, everything had been attached with giant steel rods and lots of epoxy and polyester resin. And it was really hard to get anything out. And it took a lot of time and a lot of risk to the stone. So we wanted to minimize that. But we couldn't really come up with a completely different way of supporting the torso. So we did line the recesses in the torso with B-stepping 2 before we put the Hilti epoxy in with the anchors. And then in the thigh, we tried using a release agent on the threads of the anchor before we put it into the epoxy, so that ideally we'd be able to turn it out. And we have a picture of that if anybody is interested in more details, but I won't go there right
now. What, if any, engineering resources did you have when you were determining the sort of size and scale of the mount? Because I assume that it's all structurally welded, and I was curious if your design went through engineer approval.
So I guess I'll take the first part of that. So initially in the rigging and moving of Krishna, we determined center of gravity, mass distribution of the stone, and the general positioning. When it came down to the actual tang mount design in the back of the torso, that's when the consultation with the engineering school at Case came into effect. I think Beth and Philip.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We also did work with actually 2 different outside engineering firms. We worked with Silman Engineering in New York and also a firm here in Cleveland to review the entire design of the mount, assess all of the forces that would be on all of the parts. It was, let's see, they made some modifications to the hand mount, for example. So we reviewed all of those parts with an engineering firm. And then the tests on the actual epoxy that we chose for the anchors was done with the engineering school.
Hi, not really a question, but more of just a commendment. It's a great design on a lot of levels. One, the adjustability of the mount design is brilliant. I have to say that was thought of in advance and gives you the flexibility to adapt as you're working with those difficult pieces. And then also the rigging, or not the rigging, but the lack of having to do rigging, that you've thought of that as well, as incorporating the mount sections into external mounts that could be used for transport. And so you didn't have to do all the complicated rigging so I just wanted to say that wonderful that you thought of that.
Yeah, for the most part, rigging was very minimal. The apparatus that Philip built to fit onto the lift truck forks allowed us full rotation, and we could block it in place so we didn't have to worry about drift over time and keeping the sculpture up in the air. Crating was done for the most part exterior blow away crates, so it was built around the platforms and the hand section, which just bolts directly into a crate, which minimizes the handling.
I just wanted to say I think it's great that over here that everybody was willing to share and exchange components of the two statues, and it's really cool that they were both exhibited together. I think you just answered my question, but you don't have to disassemble it to transport it then?
We do. The thigh section comes off. The dovetails are slid together and held with two small set screws or grub screws. So each section, the thigh, the calf, the torso, and the hand all have their individual packings. The thigh and the calf go together in a single crate. So it does come apart for transport and for storage, so. Thank you. Sure. Oh, that's good, yeah. Yeah, so we just used a bag covering, and then our initial layering for packing was we took a scan and CNC cut foam to fit the torso, and then we used those layers to create the bedding that the torso would sit on, and then we allowed for a strap for transport because we do have to lift him out of that and put him on a working stand so that we can attach the mount, which is 75 pounds. It's solid steel, machined, and has a fix-it interface that's lined against the back of the torso. But that mount also provides a great counterweight for the body itself, which is head heavy, shoulder and head heavy. So in the case of our last installation, we had some equipment difficulties, so we actually used chain falls and strap, a regular rig for installation, but the counterweight of the mount actually made it pretty enjoyable, almost relaxing. It might have just been the look on his face, but you know, so.
I think that's just how strong Arthur is, actually.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, I love building massive mounts like this, and this has been so spectacular to look at and to see what you've done, but I'm totally curious, what is the weight of the mount when it's fully installed?
So the primary mast and base is 1,100 pounds. The tang in the torso is 75. The post and contoured shaped steel mount for the shin is about 3.5 pounds. The plate for the hand stela is about 45 pounds altogether. I believe that's with a lifting mechanism that bolts on the back. And the thigh dovetails, it's kind of a negligible weight. It's a steel alloy, so the weight is negligible.
1,100 pounds was perfect.
Yeah, well, that's just the stand.
Once you exceed that weight, then it's all just kind of extra, but that's really wonderful. Congratulations.
Right. Any other? No? Anybody? Going once? Going twice? No. Thank you.
I can't quite hear what's going on. We have a few parts of the mount here. If anybody has questions in particular, we have a mock-up of the torso mount, the lifting mechanism, and some other things. If anybody has any other questions about those assemblies.
All right. Well, it was an excellent presentation and an excellent mount. I love the idea of incorporating the lifting apparatus to the mount itself. Oh, there is a question. Oh, sorry.
Just real quick, do you have photos, or can we see the dovetail mount again?
Why, yes, we do. I don't have the.
Are you sure?
It's not in that one.
Oh.
We just have to show the real deal.
Here's a prototype. Let's see, can you see? So this is an aluminum prototype, but the real one is McMaster Carr's ultra strength steel. I guess you really can't see it very well. Yeah. This is just a prototype, but it slides back and forth. And I put nylon tip set screws at the bottom of it. So this would fit up in between the, where's this? Here you go. It would fit between these two surfaces. The reason why this actually can happen is we didn't have time to talk about it in the talk, but this was kind of brutally hacked apart to turn it into a seated Buddha. So if you can visualize this as a seated Buddha, that's why they did it. And so they literally just took it apart with pickaxes at the beginning of the last century. And so there's a lot of loss in this area, which allows us to fit a dovetail in between those two surfaces. Ordinarily, when you have a broken sculpture, you wouldn't have the room to put that in there. So this is one of the few times you could actually do that. And it was just seemed to be the logical thing for me to do. I puzzled at it. First, I was going to have external mounts, and of course, nobody liked that, the look of it. They really wanted to just float. They said, well, figure out somehow to make it like, and I'm like, I don't know. And then I don't know how I thought about it. I guess looking at the milling machine, I was sitting there, and the inspiration is the dovetails on a milling machine or on a like a hard-inch lathe, you know, how they have the dovetails. That was the inspiration for it. But basically, it goes together like this, and then there's set screws that are just very fine at the bottom, just in case. It's really belt and suspenders because it's really not going to slip apart. But those nylon tip set screws go in and lock it just like you'd lock on the milling machine, your Bridgeport. You lock it to keep it from moving. So that's the inspiration for it. We didn't have pictures, huh? On the slideshow.
They're in the first slideshow. We can go back to that.
Okay. Yeah, they're in the first slideshow. I don't know if they could rewind it.
What was the name of that product again? You said from McMaster you ordered it just as is?
Hey guys, we can't hear you. You might have been muted.
Okay, it is not a ready-made product. I had to mill it with a dovetail cutter, so I had to make this. It's not something you just buy. I bought the ultra steel. I forget what they call it. I could look it up here real quick.
So you machined that piece?
Yes, out of ultra. I look up McMaster Carr. Look up ultra strength steel. They use it for bridges, real high strength applications. I just try to find the strongest because it's so thin. I had to find the dovetails are minimal. So I had to find something that just couldn't possibly fail. And so I chose that. It milled really nicely.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
We miss you, Philip.